Good morning, man. How you guys doing? So, in the final chapter of Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis writes briefly of his transition from pure and simple theism to Christianity. Theism would be the belief in God, but not necessarily the belief in the gospel. It was on a walk with J.R.R. Tolkien on Addison's walk along the Thames River at Oxford, and the subsequent discussion that followed. The problem with Lewis, according to Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, for any of you that don't know, quote, lay not in his rational failure to understand the theory, but in his imaginative failure to grasp its significance. So what he's talking about is that Tolkien, as a professor, along with Lewis as a professor at Oxford, had been talking about Christianity. Now, Tolkien is a Christian. He's a Catholic Christian trying to convince Lewis of Christianity, and Lewis is struggling with it. So I've been to Addison's Walk in Oxford because of these conversations, and I wanted to be there. I've taken a picture of the exact area where Lewis gave his heart to Christ, became a believer, and became one of the greatest apologists, really, of the 20th century. Tolkien argued that Lewis ought to approach the New Testament with the same sense of imaginative openness, expectation. Let me say that again. Tolkien argued that Lewis ought to approach the New Testament with the same sense of imaginative openness, expectation that he approached pagan myths in his professional studies. The story of Christ, he wrote, is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as others do, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. And so soon after that, Lewis gave his heart to Christ, became a Jesus follower, and then one of the great apologists of the 20th century. Mere Christianity probably being his most famous work. Let me give you a definition of imagination. Imagination is the faculty or action of forming new ideas or images or concepts of external objects not present to the senses. So I want to look, again, like we started last week, I want to look at the David and Goliath story, the Sunday school story that everybody knows here. That is one of two things that you know about David. You either know about David and Goliath or David and Bathsheba. And I want to look at it from a perspective of a fear, a valley of fear, which is what we talked about last week. And I talked about the characteristics of fear, how fear atrophies and fear tends to stymie your faith and your ability to think creatively. That was one of my points last week, if you remember. But I want to look today at David and Goliath's story, looking at the second half of the story, and we'll just move a little bit further. We'll actually cover more even next week. But this idea of a Goliath-saturated imagination versus a God-saturated imagination. That what David is entering is what I'm going to call a Goliath-saturated imagination. Now, I cover this in my book, Worshiper Warrior. You that have, I think most of you in this room have read my book, but on that chapter, I think it's called Imagination, I talk about this. So, I'm of the belief that innovation, the ability to be an entrepreneur, the ability to innovate comes from a God-anointed or a God-saturated imagination. So if you can't see creatively solutions to problems, you're going to be unable to be able to make an impact in something new, in a new area. And not everybody's, I will say, the statistics show that only 12% of the population would fall into the category of creative. So 88% of us are not creative, 88% of us tend to be the followers of those who are creative, okay? Now, I believe that is not accurate to the God-formed, God-image, original factory plan from God. That most of us in this room are way more imaginative and creative than we think, but we've been conditioned by schools. The school system, which originally was set up by Rockefeller, who understood that he needed more workers. So he was building the factories. He was being imaginative. He was being creative. He just needed more people to do his bidding so he could make more money. Big Pharma came from Rockefeller. And I could go off on that history too, but I've blogged on it. You can look at my blog if you ever want to see it. It's actually a really good blog. Actually, it's two of them on Rockefeller. And how he realized at one point that oil, as he was manufacturing it, was getting more and more competition. And he needed a new way. He needed a new imaginative way. So he came up with the idea of using oil for pharmaceuticals. So a lot of your pharmaceuticals are from oil-based toxins that are within them. So that's a whole nother story. That's actually where, I'm already getting off on this, but that's actually where vegetable oil comes from. That's where canola oil comes from. If you're eating, which probably 95% of you in this room are, eating seed oils, you're putting petroleum into your bodies, okay? So if what you need to do is go home and tell your wife, we need to cook hot stuff with avocado oil and cold stuff with olive oil. But that's another issue that I talk about all the time, but not here. Now listen. So let's look at here's three characteristics. What I see, we're not going to read it. It's too much to read. It's a big chapter. We already covered the first part last week. But let me give you three characteristics to the Goliath-saturated imagination. Number one, and this comes from the Valley of Elah here, the Goliath-saturated imagination tricks you to think it's insurmountable. So the Goliath-saturated imagination, wherein you begin to focus so much on the Goliaths and the mountains in your life, it tricks your mind. It tricks your heart. It tricks you into thinking this is insurmountable. There's nothing I can do to move this mountain. There's nothing to do to take out this giant. A lot of you in your life are right there right now. You have a Goliath in your life that just seems insurmountable. And the more you focus on it, the bigger it gets. It just keeps growing and growing and growing because you have a Goliath-saturated imagination. You realize that imagination, the ability to create, is positive and negative. Right? So you can start creatively building this Goliath if you choose to. Number two, the Goliath-saturated imagination tricks you to think you're alone. It tricks you into thinking you're all alone. You're the only one that struggles with that. And if you share that with someone, they're going to think less of you. They're not going to respect you anymore. That's why you come here. That's why you're at a table. And the more you come and the more vulnerable you become and the more open you become, the more healed you will be. All the studies show that. Christian and secular, that the way to break the power of shame, the way to break the power of a sense of failure over your life is to share your shame and to share your failure. The Bible says that. Confess your sins to one another and you shall be healed. So God made us to share. God made us to actually need each other. And Christians, or supposed Christians, who have no church family, who have no relationship, something like this in their life, are destined to never reach their full potential. Are they saved? Yeah, they're saved. They're going to heaven. I'm not of the persuasion, no church, no salvation. But I am of the persuasion, no blood-stained allies, no growth. So we need blood-stained allies. And so the trick of the enemy working through a Goliath-saturated imagination is to convince you that you're all alone, that you're unique, nobody's like you, and nobody struggles with what you struggle with. Number 3, the Goliath-saturated imagination makes you fearful. And we talked about that a lot last week. I gave you these 4 ways that fear locks you down. So now enters David. David enters now the valley of Elah. So let's pick it up at verse 26. We covered the first part. We went to verse 25 last week. Verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So here's a young man, probably 13, 14 years old, who comes with a God-sized, God-saturated imagination. He's actually somewhat oblivious of the Goliath-saturated imagination of the other men. So he comes in, and it appears that it doesn't even affect him. And as the story goes, you know that it didn't, because we all know the story. But he came in to this fearful valley. We all have fearful valleys in our life. And yet, because of who he was and where he had come from, he's not influenced by that. So here's the first characteristic. Let me give you 3 characteristics of a God-saturated or a God-sized imagination. Number 1, a God-sized or God-saturated imagination sizes up the enemy. Because I think it's really important that we understand it's not that we somehow overly imagine how powerful we are. A lot of Christians do this. And they quote Bible verses, big Bible verses. I can do all things through God who strengthens me. Things like that. You see football players all the time with that verse on their arm, tattooed, or written on their, their nose piece or whatever. That's great. I think it's fantastic. And if you have that tattooed somewhere, that's great. It's fantastic. But the tendency sometimes is to just throw a verse at it and make this big statement, and you really, really don't mean it, and you really don't live it, but you act like you do, because you're a religious poser. And so you know how to pose and to seem cool and have all these big verses and everything. But what David does, he's sizing up the enemy. So he's looking at the situation, and he's not so oblivious to it or so idealistic in his viewpoint not to realize, I've got to think this thing through. So I think he's sizing up Goliath. So church, men, size up the problem. Look at the problem, size it up with a God-saturated, a God-creative imagination. God's got imaginative ideas, creative new ways to do things that have never been done before through some of you in this room. But you're of the belief, because of your background, because of things that have been said to you, and you're scripting, that God can't use you. That you've been so focused on a particular way of doing life that that's what you're locked into. I know, I'm the same way. We're all that way. I'm challenging you to size up your situation and ask God for new, creative, innovative ways to handle your life that will make a difference by creating new outcomes. And you guys I think we've all heard that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, and doing the same thing and expecting different results. You're going to have to work out your brain, work out your heart in different ways. The weights you've been using are not good enough for the mountains that are coming your way. There are mountains coming. There are obstacles coming to America, to this county, and to your life that business as usual is not going to cut it. Demons already know that. And they want to keep you locked into a Goliath saturated imagination because they can keep you atrophied, stymied, sort of spiritually bedridden, when God's calling you to be a warrior. God's calling you to be a worshiper and a warrior. God's calling you to have a God-saturated imagination. Number 2, look at verse 27. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and insolence of your heart, for you have come down just to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and the people answered him as the first one did. Number 2, a God-shaped or a God-saturated imagination is about a cause. It's about a cause. It's about a mission. Bigger than you. Bigger than your life. God's called you to live for things that are greater than you, for the kingdom of God. And when you start to live for that, there's always going to be an older brother. There's always going to be an Eliab. You start living with a God-saturated imagination, there's going to be Christian brothers and sisters in the church and around you. That'll never happen. You can't do that. Those are the Eliabs. Expect them. I like what David did. He just listened to his brother, and then he just turned around and showed him his back. He did not listen for long. So guys, what are you living for? What are you here for? Why are you here? 2024. November 2024. God's handpicked each one of you for special work, special assignment from him. You have an assignment from God. Have you discovered it? And it begins, I believe, at home with your wife and family if you're married. It begins with you being the kingdom. Don't go and change the world if you can't make up your bed. Don't go and change the world if you can't figure out how to work on your porn problem. Some of you are so saturated with porn, you come here because we have good breakfasts and everything, and you fall asleep when I speak. But you're a porn addict, all right? And if you don't have the strength of character and discipline to learn how to figure out how to just quit looking at porn, then all you're doing is tying yourself up with demons that are going to saturate your mental capacities for the rest of your life, and you're actually destroying your brain cells. The dopamine dump, the dopamine fix that comes through porn is the same as a cocaine habit. You're a cocaine addict. I mean, you're at the same, all the scientific studies show it's the same level as a cocaine addict. Now, you would never think of doing cocaine. Why would you need cocaine? You get the same fix through porn. I know it sounds kind of mean-spirited and everything, and I'm usually really nice and everything when I'm up here. But I feel for you because you have that, you're missing out on so much. You're just missing out on the joy of great sex with your wife if you're married, because it ruins your sex life. Why do we have all these commercials about dysfunctional issues in the sex area on the internet and on TV, it's because of porn. They don't tell you that. So you're ruining your life, man, and you're actually destroying your brain cells, and you're like a cocaine addict. So I can talk till the cows come home about having a cause and a mission, but I'd say start right there. Just right there. Be honest today. Hey, look, guys, I struggle with porn, because we all know you do. Everybody at the table already knows you do, because they do. And sometimes it takes one guy just to tell the truth, and everybody can start telling the truth and quit playing around with it. And then when you have blood-stained allies, you might get set free. What a novel idea that you'd get set free from porn. So it is not the issue, by the way. The issue is not porn in America with men. The issue is isolation with men in America. In other words, the enemy knows that he can get you with porn because you're isolated, you're alone whenever you look at it. And then you get so filled up with shame about it that you don't share it, so you stay in isolation. And the reason we created Wholehearted Men on Tuesday mornings in tables was to at least give it a fighting chance that a group of guys meeting regularly would actually become honest and break the demonic power of isolation. Because if you do that, you can be set free. It is possible to be set free in that area, and I know hundreds of men that have been. Some are in this room. It's really exciting. So then what happens is you'll be gripped with a mission. You'll be gripped with a cause that God couldn't even speak to you about because you couldn't hear his voice because you were so demonized with these addictions. And if I didn't believe that Christ came to set the captives free, I never would have become a pastor. I believe this stuff. I really believe that God sets the captives free. And so all I can say is I put that before you, that there's this God-saturated imagination that can begin to overwhelm you if you're willing to battle in this valley of fear that we live in. Verse 31, now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. And then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you're a youth and a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and I struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and I struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. So a God-saturated imagination is field-tested. A God-saturated imagination is field-tested. So in other words, every battle that you're fighting is impacting the next battle that you're going to fight. So I don't know what your battle is. I don't know what you're going through. You know what you're going through. God knows what you're going through. Maybe at your table you can share what you're going through. But it's really hard to have a God-saturated, a God-sized imagination if you keep failing every time. In other words, the thing that you are battling with, you just continue to fail in and continue to fall in. It doesn't mean that we're going to find, I'm not saying sinless perfection or something, but what I am saying, though, is that you need some victories. You see, what gave David confidence with Goliath was that he had fought smaller, I wouldn't say smaller, but I would say he had fought less significant foes that no one even knew about. These were in the privacy of the hills of Bethlehem. I doubt he came home and told everybody But he was field tested, man. He didn't just come out of the chute one day and decide to become a warrior. He was already a warrior since a young man. He had learned to war in his imagination. He had learned to war in private before God used him in public. So church, men, God's got battles you're fighting right now, and you need help. We need each other. We need to be honest about our battles, start sharing them, get the demons out by being willing to share that, set up accountability or covenant eyes on your computer. I don't know. You have to figure that out, but you can be set free. And you'll build confidence that way. And by the way, everything's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's never 3 steps forward. So from this day on, it's going to be complete victory. But it's when you start thinking that way that we have a God who's bigger than any of my Goliaths. That God's going to give me promises from His Word by spending time in His Word that builds a God-sized imagination into our heart that I'm an overcomer. You can't be an overcomer if you don't have the power to overcome. And God's got such big mountains coming our way in the days ahead that our challenge today is be an overcomer. Be an overcomer. You can do that. You have the power of the Holy Spirit living within you. And if you're here today and you're not sure if you're saved, if you're not sure that you have a personal relationship with Christ, you may be high on religion and low on relationship, come to Jesus. Share with the group. I don't know if I'm saved. I don't know if I were to die tonight, I'm going to go to heaven. I don't know that. And then let those guys pray with you and invite Jesus into your heart. Begin that wonderful journey if you've never done that. All right? Okay, so you got some questions on table talk for you guys. God bless you. Thanks for being here.